Hi guys, welcome to the alternate and historical fiction track with Dragon Con. This panel is going to be Scandalous Historical Gossip. It is going to be a fun time to be had with our lovely panelists here discussing some lovely tea spilling or whatever drink that they happen to be drinking tonight. And they are just going to be giving us some lovely juicy tidbits and tales from stories that they have gathered up as they do research on their stories of their own. I'm going to let our lovely moderator, Miss Gail Martin, take it away. But you can join us anytime here on our YouTube, our social media, or join us in person at the Alternate and Historical Fiction Track at DragonCon in Atlanta, Georgia.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Ray, and thanks to all the crowd there at DragonCon bringing this to us and making this available. I'm going to let our wonderful panelists introduce themselves, so starting with Nancy.
I'm Nancy Northcott. I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books and independently publish a couple of subgenres of romance and some science fiction, and I love weird history stuff.
Very good. Katie. Oh, you're muted.
There we go. I can zoom. Hello, everyone. I'm Katie Cross. I write a young adult fantasy world that is kind of a secondary medieval historical kind of feel to it.
Very good. Drew.
Sorry, am I Drew?
Yes. Dave.
I'm Dave.
Sorry. You're
Yeah,
Dave.
okay.
I can't.
No, I was just zoning out, and then I thought, wait a minute.
Nope, Dave. Sorry. My bad.
It's all right. When I was a kid, I had a friend call me Mitch for 2 years. I could never get him to remember my name, so I just started answering to Mitch. So wasn't much of a friend. My name is Dave. Past tense in July, my 17th novel came out. I write various kinds of fantasy and science fiction. I'm also an editor with Baen Books. Happy to be here.
Very good. Cecilia.
Hello, I am Cecilia Dominic, and this is my supervisor, Timothy Mouse. Together, we write urban fantasy and steampunk. By day, I am a clinical psychologist. I help people sleep without drugs. By night, I write USA Today best-selling books, and I hope to keep my readers turning the pages all night. It's not a conflict of interest. It's a business plan.
And I'm Gail Z. Martin and Morgan Brice. As Gail, I write epic and urban fantasy. As Morgan, I write urban fantasy, male paranormal romance. But I do a lot of historical research for all of the books. And, you can't make this stuff up. So when I can find cool stuff from the past that I can blatantly riff off of, it is a wonderful thing. And I think it adds, some realism to the books, even though I just love digging for the dirt. Anyhow, we're going to go around and share what we've found of scandalous things from the past, however you define scandalous. And now we'll go around, each one give a scandalous tale, and then we'll go around again for however long we can stretch this out. So, Nancy, starting with you.
Well, my scandalous tale goes back to the 15th century, and it was a very well-kept secret that did not come out for 23 or 4 years. Edward IV of England had what we might call an eye for the ladies, if we were speaking in my parents' parlance. And he married his queen, Elizabeth Woodville, in secret. But she would not hop into the royal sheets without marriage. So he married her and kept that a secret. And that didn't come out until the Earl of Warwick was pushing a French marriage in council. And finally, Edward had to come out and go, I can't marry her because I'm already married. And that was quite stuff hitting the fan. So that eventually settled down. They had numerous children together. Fast forward to 1483, and Edward dies prematurely in his 40s. His son, Edward, his older son, is proclaimed king, is brought to London, and preparations for coronation begin apace. Then information comes out, and the proof is lost to us now, but it was shown to people in 1483 who found it convincing that Edward had pulled the same trick as he had with Elizabeth, with one Lady Eleanor Butler 3 years previously. So he had contracted marriage with her, which is promised to marry her in 1461 or so. And under medieval canon law, if you promised to marry somebody and then consummated that promise, you might as well have spoken vows in church. You were married. But then Edward left Eleanor in the dust and moved on, ultimately doing something similar with the woman who became his queen. So it sort of leaves you wondering kind of how many people he might have done that with in between, because it's a successful scam. So, hey, unfortunately, when this information came to light in 1483, his marriage to Elizabeth was ruled bigamous because Eleanor was still alive at the time he pulled his little scam with Elizabeth. That meant that their children were bastards and were ineligible to inherit the English throne. And that meant that Edward's brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became King Richard III. So Edward's inability to sort out his personal matters, or his tendency to sweep them under the rug, literally altered the succession to the throne of England.
Nice. Very good. Katie.
Okay, so I just finished this book. It was yesterday, actually. It was so exciting. It's called The Bookwoman's Daughter by Kim Michelle Richardson. And it's a historical fiction that takes place in Kentucky, like in the 1950s. And it covers who they call the blue folk. So there was a guy like in the 1800s that came over from France. I can't remember his name. And he had methemoglobinemia, which means there's a byproduct of hemoglobin called methemoglobin, and he had a gene issue where he would produce too much methemoglobin. It would turn his blood brown instead of red because you don't get as much oxygen attached to your hemoglobin. So his skin appeared blue, like Avatar blue. It's the craziest thing if you Google it and look at the pictures. Well, then he had kids. So then there's this whole family of like people with blue skin, and then they had kids, and sometimes the gene would present and sometimes it wouldn't, and they were like put under like race laws because they weren't considered white skinned, right? So they were considered a different one, so they couldn't marry white people. Like there's this whole crazy scandalous subterranean thing going on with these people that actually have really quite beautiful skin when you look at it, but if you were to see it in person, you would think they were like cyanotic or breathing or something. That's been my latest, like, from history, scandalous story, especially as you dive into this family and what they have going on. It was really fascinating. I highly recommend that book. It's actually it's a sequel, but a standalone to The Bookwoman's Daughter by the same author. And they're both set in like Appalachia in the 1930s, 1950s. Really cool.
Very, very interesting. Dave.
Okay. So I live in Utah, and there was a family of Shoshone brothers who kind of have their names all over the state. And one of them is called Walker or Wakara. And he led a Shoshone war band here in the valley where I live. And actually one historian called him the greatest horse thief in history. Wakara would go down to Southern California, which is 10 hours away in car, right, to steal horses in the 1840s and 50s, and bring them back here. I mean, obviously steal horses in a sort of a horse and cattle stealing culture where this is the act of a, brave and valorous warrior, right? So, and when the Mormons moved down here, they had a war. Kind of a 3-4 month fight with Wakara, which is sometimes called Walker's War, that ended in a truce. And one of the promises that was offered at the end by one of the Mormon guys, I think his name is Isaac Morley. That could be wrong. Isaac something. They ended with sort of reciprocal gestures of respect. Okay. So one of the promises the local Mormon leaders made was, we'll speak at your funeral. We'll send Isaac Morley here, our guy, to come speak at your funeral as an indication of how much we esteem you. So a few years later, Wakara dies, and Morley and one of the other Mormon guys, ride out there to a hillside somewhere near Beaver, Utah, to go to the funeral. And this is 1855. Okay, so Millard Fillmore is president of the United States. This is 1855, and they tie Wakara to a horse. Wakara's people do, right? He's going into the spirit world upright, and they put into his dead hand a letter addressed to him personally from Brigham Young to show that he's like a noble leader, right? He communes with the other chieftains of the land, and then they lead the horse. So these two Mormon elders are standing there watching this. They lead the horse into a cave and slaughter the horse, and then they lead two women into the cave who are two of Wakara's wives, and they kill them too, right? Human sacrifice. And then they chain two Paiute slave children to the outside of the cave to leave them there living, to starve to death and be eaten by wild beasts, to serve Wakara and his two wives in the afterlife. And the whole time, these two like unarmed Mormon dudes are standing there afraid that if they do anything, not only will they be personally killed, which would be a bummer, but they'll restart the war. And so they go through with it, and they watch this whole human sacrifice, and basically 4 people and a horse are all slaughtered at this funeral, and preach a funeral sermon about how great Chief Wakara was, and then ride home and put it in their journals. And it was 1855, and Millard Fillmore was president in the United States.
Boy, and you thought you'd been at some awkward funerals. Cecilia.
When I was doing research for my If You're Psychic series, specifically the first book, Era's Element, I was looking back into Victorian archaeology. And since the heroine Iris really wants to be an archaeologist, I was looking to see, okay, who would her role models be at the time? And so I came across the fascinating story of Jane Dieulafoy. She was French, and she was scandalous for several reasons. First, she and her husband had a very equal relationship. She was not the Victorian woman who was submissive and was going to stay home while her husband went off on adventures. No, she went on his archaeological digs with him. As if that wasn't scandalous enough, she wore pants. And yes, and even after coming back from an archaeological expedition, they were so famous and well known for their finds. They unearthed someplace in Persia that was really quite spectacular and brought back like lion mosaics that was, I guess they're still in the Louvre. I don't know if they've been repatriated or not. Yes, all of this Victorian archaeological history kind of sort of mentions, but mostly glosses over the stealing of national treasures. But anyway, so she wore pants. And the French government actually issued a decree to allow her to wear pants. And she was also, because, in these archaeological digs, conditions are harsh, there's lice, so she kept her hair short while she was in the field. Had to shave her head several times because they didn't have the icky lice shampoo that, we voice on kids. And so she kept her hair short while in Paris. And so, of course, there's been lots of speculation. Was she actually a lesbian? But no, apparently she and her husband had a very loving relationship, although nothing I read about her mentioned anything about children. So I guess that question is still up in the air. I have not yet had my heroine wear pants, but it might have to come soon.
Very good. So I'm going to tell you the story some people have called the crime of the century. Now, I think the people who termed it that, considering it happened in 1906, badly underestimated what was to come in the rest of the 20th century. But it's still a pretty hot number. There is a very famous architect named Stanford White. He has designed the mansions on Fifth Avenue for the likes of the Astors and the Vanderbilts. Then there's the somewhat wastrel son of a famous, wealthy Pittsburgh Railroad family, Harry Thaw. And then there is a young, beautiful, aspiring actress named Evelyn Nesbit. And they all become players in this fantastic tragedy. Now, Stanford was known for, let's just say he wouldn't have survived the Me Too campaign because he earned it. He was a creeper. He went after much younger women. Evelyn was 16. He was 48. And he seduced her. He got her up to his Madison Square Garden penthouse apartment and got her drunk and took advantage of her. Harry had been very attentive to Evelyn, even though she had kept him at a distance. He was a sort of odd duck, and she didn't quite know what to make of him. But he was persistent, and I think she saw it as a way out. Now, Stanford was known for having not only bringing a slew of young girls through his penthouse, but he had a red velvet swing that was that hung from the ceiling, and it was a big thing to have. That was part of his entertaining. Let's just say, you can interpret that however you want, but a red velvet swing was known to be in his penthouse, and so that becomes important. Hang in there with me. So Thaw ended up marrying Nesbit, but he was abusive too. So poor Evelyn couldn't get a break. And Thaw was not, he was very unstable. So he thought that he was very hung up on the concept of virginity. He knew what had happened to Evelyn with Stanford. And he was sure that all of their problems in their marriage couldn't possibly be due to his own abuse. It must be because of what happened with Stanford. So he confronts Stanford, these two really wealthy, super well-connected men, in Madison Square Garden in front of hundreds of witnesses, and shoots Stanford 3 times in the face. Clearly, this finally gets rid of Stanford. It becomes the crime of the century. Harry goes on trial. He is acquitted by reason of insanity. I think Evelyn finally makes it to France and just goes away. But there is a 1950s movie based on this called The Girl in the Red Velvet Swing. And for a time, it was the hottest scandal. It's still referred to as the crime of the century in Pittsburgh, which is where Thaw was from. But yeah, it definitely made the gossip columns and gave everybody something to talk about till the next time. Back to you, Nancy.
Well, let's switch continents and go to 1920s United States. And when you hear the name Warren G. Harding, if you are a history person and even pay attention to who that is, probably the return to normalcy comes quickly to mind. It's not like he did a lot to distinguish himself in the records of presidents of the United States, or possibly the Teapot Dome scandal, oil rights leasing. But like so many, he had his own canoodling habits. And he had a daughter with a woman he had a relationship with who was not his wife. Harding died in 1923, and the girl's existence was revealed in 1927. The Harding family denied it, and it kind of hovered out there unconfirmed for decades, but was finally confirmed by DNA testing in 2015. So in addition to return to normalcy that opened the floodgates for one of the most corrupt administrations in American history, and selling off oil rights and bribery, we can add a mistress and an illegitimate child. And that's more about Warren Harding, who was succeeded by Silent Cal Coolidge, who didn't say much.
Katie.
So I wrote this book titled The Sword Maker. It's about a sword maker, and he lives in a frozen kind of Arctic climate. So I did a bunch of research on Arctic climates and Inuits and that kind of thing, which led me into the race for the North and South poles historically. I don't normally dabble this much in the 1930s or whatever, but this happened. So I want you to picture it's 1931. We're in Greenland. Okay, so in Greenland, 1931, it's the middle of the winter, and there's this guy named, I had to write his name down, I'll forget it, Augustine Courtauld. Anyway, he is in this sledging party up at this north area of Greenland, and he's there because there are 2 guys that have been taking weather observations, and he is going to be replace them. But the weather's too bad. They literally just have a tent, and they have paraffin that they burn, and then they just have all their food with them and some books. That's it. And then they take weather observations 5 times a day. Well, it's too cold. The weather's too bad. So the leader of this mission is Geno Watkins. He says, we're just not going to do it. And Courtaild's like, well, the whole reason we're here is to get these weather readings. But Gino's like, it's not safe. We don't have two people. We don't have enough for two people. So Courtaild's like, I'll do it myself. Like, it's just 3 months. I'll stay up here in Greenland by myself in the middle of the winter. No problem. Like, where it regularly gets to -50 below 0 Fahrenheit. So he ends up convincing his mission leader to let him do this. And this book I was reading goes into this whole story where he's there all by himself for 3 months. Well, 2 of his tins or 4 of his tins of paraffin wax leak. And that's the only heat source that he has. And then the blizzards get so bad, he literally becomes buried alive in his tent. He can't chip his way out because he doesn't have an ice axe. So he would tunnel out to go make the weather measurements. Well, he can't do that anymore. So he's literally buried in snow. A team comes and looks for him and drives right by him because he's all the way in the snow. They can't find him. Literally, he is on his last drop of paraffin, like his very last drop. It goes out. He has a couple days of food. He's in total blackness. He's completely buried. The snow is about to cave in and crush him because there's so much ice. We're talking like 6 to 7 feet of ice and snow on top of him. And there's one little hole like at the top of his tent where smoke had been escaping, and it was blocked. He couldn't get to it, or he had tried to dig out that way. And all of a sudden, his lamp goes out and he's resigned himself to die. And he hears a voice shout like down this tiny chimney. There's like sounds. People are like, he thinks he hears walking, and someone shouts down there, and it's Gino, his leader. And they have just got there to find him. And he's been buried alive, I think, weeks down there, like surviving on the last of his wax. As I was listening to this audiobook, I was like, you literally can't make it up. It was like to the minute that they find him when he runs out. And I was like, that's almost like fiction. Like, it was made up so well. It climaxes so perfectly.
Very interesting. Dave?
So I like the history of music is sometimes sort of reflecting secret currents of history. Here's a song with history I like quite a bit. Louis XIV, the Sun King, felt like he should rule all of Europe, and he was an autocrat in France, and had absolute dictatorial authority over all his generals and his nobles and military, and the rest of Europe in this kind of ragtag alliance threw up a guy named John Churchill to fight against him. This is about 13 generations or so great-grandfather of Winston Churchill. And John Churchill had none of those advantages, right? John Churchill had like his allies would be like, there's some Dutch guys and there's some Polish people and they would always fight amongst each other. So he had to constantly not only lead people into battle and choose a strategy, but he had to negotiate to keep them there. And the Dutch wanted him to keep a record of all the money spent. So he was also writing voluminous letters back to the leaders who had him in the field, explaining what he spent the money on and justifying everything he did. And nevertheless, for 10 years, John Churchill went absolutely undefeated against Louis XIV and just beat him every time, again and again and again. And the French hated him. And at a certain point, he became the Duke of Marlborough, okay, which is hard enough for me to pronounce, but the French couldn't pronounce it at all. So when they heard a rumor that he was dead, they wrote folk song, some person whom we do not know, wrote a song celebrating his death, okay. And because they couldn't say Marlborough, they said Mombrook. Is how they tried to articulate his title, right? The song caught on like wildfire. French loved it. So the song's called Mombrook s'en va en guerre. Mombrook goes to war, and caught on like wildfire. It got translated into German versions, into Dutch versions. A century later, Goethe, traveling the continent, complained about it in his diary, said it's like the whole continent has an earworm. Everybody's singing a version of this stupid song, okay? And the lyrics are silly. basically, Marlborough goes off to war. When will he come back? We don't know. Oh, his wife is waiting for him in a tower. Oh, a messenger rides up. Where's Monbrook? Oh, he is dead. Are you sure he is dead? He is dead. Like, that's kind of how the song goes. Okay. It's not a great lyric. Sucked for the French, though, right? It turned out he wasn't dead, and he went on beating them for several more years before he retired from the field. So, but the song sort of not only became this earworm for decades after both Louis XIV and John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, were dead, but that lived on, right? So it's actually, the melody, although you may never have heard of the song. So I'm going to endeavor to sing without even an instrument. Okay, so it goes, Mambruksen. Mambruksen vatan get. Oh man, now I'm not gonna be able to do it. Mambruksen vatan guerre, mironton pena. Mambruksen vatan guerre, ne sait qu'on reviendra. Il reviendra à Paques, mironton pena. Il reviendra à Paques, ou à la Trinité. It's for he's a jolly good fellow. That's where the melody for He's a Jolly Good Fellow comes from, is this song in which the French prematurely celebrated the death of their English bane.
So the original Marlborough Man.
Correct. Yes. Well, he was very, okay. So there's reason to think that the upper classes in England have long been bed hoppers. Okay. Like, that's just a thing that they do. Maybe going all the way back to the Anglo-Saxons, I don't know. I mean, if you read about the late Anglo-Saxons, they would very commonly, like Harold II, Harold, who was defeated at the Battle of Hastings, had a formal wife, and he had a wife, Moredanico, which means in the Danish fashion, meaning, well, we just agreed she's my wife, right? I have a church wife, but also this wife. This is the thing they did. So John Churchill maybe got his early preferment in the army because his mistress was also the mistress of the king. So, but that's, I think, what it was to be rich in English. Maybe it still is. I don't know.
Very interesting. Cecilia.
The whole time I kept wanting to say silly English nigget. And half of the people watching are not going to get that reference, sadly. So before we started, Nancy was talking about how is this possibly true facts. And so since we've already talked about human sacrifices and multiple wives, I don't feel bad about talking about witches. And I've been doing a little bit of research into this particular history because I have a character in my upcoming trilogy with Falstaff. It's a time travel fantasy adventure, and one of the characters is a half succubus, which is a demon who gets their energy from having sex, basically. I'm sure we have all heard of the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. It came out in 1486. It was the guide at the time on how to identify and to get rid of witches, basically. It was written by a couple of Dominican friars, one of whom was Henry Kramer. Still obsessed with sexuality, just a little. And he kind of went from, okay, all women are potential witches, to, okay, they're more susceptible to being tempted by incubi and by Satan. And so the sexual immorality is going to lead to witchcraft. And of course, it all comes down to, well, how are they going to affect men's performance? Which is, where they're really feeling threatened. And so let me just read this passage to you from the Malleus Maleficarum. And you can hear the euphemisms. Basically, the euphemisms are pretty much 1980s romance novel level. So, and what then is to be thought of those witches who in this way sometimes collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest or shut them up in a box where they move themselves like living members and eat oats and corn. For a certain man tells that when he had lost his member, he approached a known witch to ask her to restore it to him. She told the afflicted man to climb a certain tree, and that he might take which he liked out of a nest in which there were several members. And when he tried to take a big one, the witch said, "You must not take that one," adding, "because it belonged to a parish priest." So apparently the priests in the Middle Ages were well endowed, or at least that's what they'd like you to think. And now I'm seeing why the Malleus Maleficarum was such popular reading.
It was the boilerplate of the time. Yeah, if you could read.
If you could read, and I mean, I imagine how many men were going around like, with their hands like this, going, "You can't have it."
Well, I'm going to talk about a different kind of rod, the South Fork Rod and Gun Club. And this was a private, rather secretive group that back in the 1880s that collected all the famous folks from the Pittsburgh area and the Pennsylvania coal barons. So the robber barons of the Gilded Age, the Carnegies, the Fricks, the coal barons, all of those folks, this little getaway in South Fork, Pennsylvania by the South Fork Dam. And they would fish and boat and shoot skeet and go hunting and just have a jolly old time. Well, the South Fork Dam was an earthen dam. And the groundskeeper who kept the property when they went back to Pittsburgh so that it was all nice and fresh when they came back, warned them that the earthen dam was not safe, that the earthen dam was starting to degrade. Well, they didn't live here all the time. They didn't want to spend money on fixing the dam. They ignored him several times. He said, "No, it's really not safe. You need to do something about this." They ignored him. You may or may not have heard about something called the Johnstown Flood. It happened in 1889. It killed over 2,200 people, wiped out the town of Johnstown, which was downriver from where the South Fork Dam was. And briefly, the outflow from the dam rushed through Johnstown at the same rate as the Mississippi River, sweeping everything away in front of it. And it not only swept away the buildings, but because natural gas lighting was very popular at the time, then it ripped those open, and then the debris floating on the surface with all the bodies and the debris caught fire. So now you have this town that has been just absolutely obliterated. It's swamped, it's burning. And the folks at the South Fork Rod and Gun Club just hummed, whistled, walked away, pretended they'd never been members, never heard of it. Oh my gosh. Until I think it was in the 1980s, somebody's granddaughter went public with the old family picture album from the South Fork Rod and Gun Club because she didn't think it was right that none of those people paid any reparations to the town of Johnstown, never paid for the loss of life, never paid for the loss of property, never paid for the damage, walked off scot-free. So she went public to the media and said, "Hey, by the way, they really were there. And maybe you can't punish them, but just know they really did it and they didn't care." So a little bit of very late justice, at least in terms of that. If you are ever in the Johnstown area, South Central Pennsylvania, there is an exceptional small museum that has a video that even still, it's probably been 20 years since I've seen it, gives me nightmares when I think of it. Actually, I think it's on YouTube. You can search Johnstown Flood Museum. Exceptionally well done. And the cemetery there in Johnstown has 1,500 of the unidentified bodies that were just, burned or retrieved after they were past recognition. And it's like going to, the cemetery in Washington, seeing all those headstones for the military, just rows and rows and rows of headstones with unidentified child, unidentified woman. Really a riveting story. And I believe David McCullum also wrote a book about the Johnstown flood that kind of reads like an adventure book and mystery thriller. But and My mom's from South Fork, so that was always kind of local history for me. All right, last round here. Nancy.
This was a secret until recently because it was covered by Britain's Official Secrets Act, and it has to do with World War II. The last book in my Borking's Honor trilogy just came out, and it's set during the summer of 1940, which was an excuse to delve into anything available about the Second World War in Britain. And I stumbled across this on Twitter, of all places. But the area that oversaw the western coast of England and the area between Britain and Ireland was called Western Approaches, and it was headquartered in Liverpool. And in the summer of 1940, Britain was losing the Battle of the Atlantic. The U-boats were pillaging Allied convoys and supplies. Until I read this book, I didn't realize how much of their fuel and food Britain was importing at the start of the war. But apparently there was a chart on the wall at the Admiralty in London, and when losses reached a certain level, they were going to have to surrender because they wouldn't be able to feed their people. So the Royal Navy pulled a captain who had been medically retired with tuberculosis out of retirement, put him in charge of the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, and gave him a bunch of Women's Royal Navy, WRN or RENs, as the majority of the staff and the tactical unit, and said, find a way to stop the U-boats. Now, this was before radar could spot anything anywhere. Radar was still in its infancy. Britain had the chain home system at this point, but they didn't have radar in aircraft. They didn't have identification friend to foe. So radar was still very primitive at this point. And so these young women set out wargaming the Battle of, and they wargamed search tactics. Instead of head for where you think the U-boat is and just drop all your depth charges, let's run these patterns with the escort convoys. And they wargamed that with submarine commanders, and they sank the submarines. So the Royal Navy had one of their most experienced and accomplished submarine commanders come in to play a U-boat commander. And they did the board game thing. And it's you look through a little visor thing at a mock-up. It's kind of like the game Battleship, and you look at the field on the floor, and then the Wrens are giving instructions from another room, and they can see it too. And they sank him. And he said, I want to meet the man who did this because I'm going to give him a ship. And in comes this young woman in her 20s. And he said, that can't be, you cheated. We're going to go again. She beat him again. And at that point, he became a believer in the system. But nobody knew about this for decades. A lot of these women died without even their closest relatives knowing they had been involved in this critical operation because of the Official Secrets Act. And they were never recognized for it. I read about it in a book called The Game of Birds and Wolves, wolves being the U-boat packs. And so a lot of journals and other documents were destroyed because nobody knew they were important. And I think that's really sad. So that's not so much scandalous as just a, wow, who would have guessed? Because I just read a book about the Battle of the Atlantic that mentions nothing about any of this. So that's me and I'll finish with my little hobby horse.
Very nice. Katie.
Nancy, I feel like it was scandalous that wasn't featured in the books you were researching, because that's a crazy story. So the final one I want to share is maybe not scandalous by the same definition, but also a really amazing story. I grew up in Idaho, like in Southeast Idaho, where there's a lot of mountains, and I live in Montana where there's a lot of mountains. And so we are just mountain people at my house. We do a lot of hiking, and we're really interested in mountaineering. And so I listen to and like research and follow climbing seasons, like when people are up in the Himalayas and the Karakoram, and like when the Everest season is open and who's going and what's going on, and Nanga Parbat and all those. I like to follow those. Kind of like some people follow football, I follow Himalayan climbers. So I always love to talk about, and I love to research like the history behind these mountains, because in my fantasy world, I have really big mountains, and I like to kind of see the evolution and how I can bring magic into it. So I was researching into George Mallory, which some people know as, he's really associated with Everest, because there's a little bit of a scandal / debate in that people wonder, is George Mallory really the first one to the top of the highest mountain in the world, or was it actually Sir Hilary that got up there like decades after George Mallory got up there? So the reason there's a big question is because Mallory was seen going up. He borrows a camera from a friend and is seen going up, and he kind of disappears in a cloud, and then no one ever sees him and his climbing partner again. Well, he had this camera, and so this huge debate is always going on, like, did he make it up and die on the way down, or did he die on the way up? And he was obsessed. Like he was really one of the frontiers, like people like going up the mountain first, you know, without oxygen, all the stuff. Like they were doing everything and trying it out. So there's been this like debate forever. So everyone is looking for this camera because they think they can find the camera and then develop it and figure out, did he take a picture up on top? Well, people have been searching for Mallory's bodies for a long time. There's been a lot of separate expeditions that went up, and they finally found him in, I think, 1990. I try to get all my facts straight. There's a lot of facts about this. I think it was in 1990, a team went up there and they actually found Mallory's body where they thought he had died, because they had seen like ice axes and stuff that were his before, that they had attributed to be his. He was laying on his face. One of his legs was severely broken. The other one was kind of pushed across it as if it was trying to hold it down. His arms were up above his head, and he was so well preserved that when they were able to move his head like away from the rock where it was frozen, they could see his stubble like on his face. His arms had darkened, but some of his skin was so frozen and well preserved, it was still kind of a white color, and they could actually like look into his eyes, which were closed, and he was perfectly preserved. So they were able to eventually like, I think they eventually buried his body, but they were looking for this camera everywhere. He had this kind of like a necklace, but it had like a bag, and it had all of these supplies and other things in it. And to this day, no one has found the camera, but pretty much almost impossible that he made it to the top. So Sir Edmund Hillary is still like holds the crown as the first one up there with his Sherpa, but is still a little bit in question of like where this camera has disappeared to.
Very good. Dave.
Okay, I'm going to tell two because they're fast. And there's thematic. They're both kind of out of the world of business. And this first one really, Cecilia, you sort of put me in mind of this. So businesses are founded for a reason. And sometimes the reason is not always apparent from what the business is or what the business ends up doing. A case in point being McDonald's. Right. So before Ray Kroc, the McDonald's brothers in San Bernardino, California, start this restaurant McDonald's. And the problem they are trying to solve is sluts. The problem is that drive-in restaurants had become synonymous with promiscuity, and that fast food waiter was becoming nearly synonymous with prostitute. So when the guy who founded JB's Big Boy tried to move his franchise out of California to other states, he would post ads for, I need to hire waitresses for my fast food restaurant, and no one would apply because they thought it was like they were being asked to do something, scandalous. So McDonald's didn't have a drive-in, so you didn't park, and the waitress didn't come see you in a shadowed corner of the parking lot. You had a drive-through where you couldn't stop, and an interior which was big and well lit with no dark corners. And the reason was to stop people from making out and having sex in the corners of the drive-in restaurant, which was a problem. So okay, that's fast. Here's another one. Armie Hammer, the actor, like he played the Lone Ranger in the movie that nobody saw. So he's actually Armie Hammer. He's Armand Hammer Jr. So his father is Armand Hammer. And Armand Hammer was a billionaire financier with a very large ego. It turned out, by the way, when we decrypted the so-called Venona decrypts, okay, we got a bunch of Soviet cables and decrypted them. One of the things we learned was that Armand Hammer was an agent for the Kremlin. They were paying him with art to perform acts of espionage in the U.S. But that's not the fun story. Here's the fun story. In the 80s, he goes on this tear, buying all the stock he can get in a company called Dutch and Church because of a kitchen product that they make, which is the baking soda Arm & Hammer. And he has decided that because it has Arm & Hammer on the box, and his name is Armand Hammer. He has to own it. And when Dutch and Church realize who it is that's buying all their shares up, they go, and why, they go talk to him and say, no, this is a very messy way to do it. Hey, just come be on the board. Come be our friend. Oh, it's so funny. Oh, your name is Arm & Hammer. That's hilarious. They put an end to the hostile takeover.
You can't make this stuff up. Cecilia?
So I was wondering how my story made you think about that. Okay, now I got it. Now it's the McDonald's Maleficarum. So I'm a psychologist by day, and I also teach continuing education to my fellow mental health professionals. And I've recently started a school called Psych Up Academy, so I can teach other people too, including authors and anyone else who wants to learn. And one of the courses I'm going to bring over is going to be my Hysteria and the Occult in Victorian Times, which I have done on a panel at Dragon Con with Leona Renee Heber. We always have a good time doing that one. So I'd like to talk about Louisa Lowe, who was born in 1820, married in September 1842. And she was sort of scandalous because she had a prenup, which I think was maybe not so dumb of her. So she basically kept her £10,000 inheritance, which was a lot of money back then, and got £1,000 per year for solo use. And this was still dispersed by a trustee, but it was pre-marriage acts. So it was the best she could do. She ended up being estranged from her husband, and she got into spiritualism. And her husband was a reverend. So as you can probably imagine, this didn't fit so well with him. So she has some erratic behavior. There was a suicide attempt. And in 1870, she's involuntarily incarcerated. And the way that this would happen would be that somebody would be interviewed separately by two different doctors, and they had to agree. And this is interesting because this is a lot more complicated than what we do today, because I'm a licensed psychologist. In Georgia, we call it, I would have to 1013 somebody, but just me. I don't have to have anybody agree with me. And so they suspect that maybe she was not interviewed so separately, like one was coming out as the other one was going in, and so they could have traded notes. And so she's incarcerated, and her husband's like, oh, wait a second, I'm paying for this, because this is, of course, she's upper middle class. This is an expensive arrangement. And so he sues for the asylum costs to come out of her money, not their money. This totally backfires on him because it gets the attention of a chancellor. She finally gets access to a lawyer, which she's been trying to do. And the commissioner advises her to have a private trial. He says, we always advise ladies in these circumstances to keep quiet. Well, she's transferred to a different asylum, and she's certified sane by a visiting physician, which is also something that doesn't ever happen anymore. Nobody's ever certified sane. And she gets 3 months probation, and she gets her sane certificate in 1872. And after that, she goes on to be a spiritualist writer. She writes of the parallels between incarceration and marriage. And she founded the Lunacy Law Reform Association. So, the moral of the story is, if you involuntarily commit your life, make sure all of your financial ducks are in a row first.
Okay. Well, I'm going to go back to the Romans, who had no shortage of scandals. And Decius Mundus was a Roman soldier, Roman knight, senior Roman army guy, who was in love with Paulina, who was an upper class Roman woman. And he made all these overtures. Paulina kept ignoring him. He just couldn't get anywhere with her. But Paulina was fascinated with the Egyptian gods. So Decius had a friend make him an Anubis costume, the Egyptian god, who dresses up like Anubis, and he sends word to Paulina that the great god Anubis has chosen her and wants her to be his acolyte and come service the great god Anubis. Well, Paulina is so starstruck that this Egyptian god has chosen her that she goes through with it, and they have a very passionate night, and Anubis gets a lot of action. And then Decius, who is really apparently not that smart, decides to rip off the mask and go, ha ha, it is I. This backfires badly on him because Paulina, being an upper middle class, wealthy Roman woman, goes to the emperor. And the emperor is kind of annoyed about this whole thing. And so she complains to the emperor. The emperor burns down the temple of Isis, kills the priests that helped Decius, and exiles Decius. So Paulina gets her revenge. Moral of the story: if you think that an ancient Egyptian god is calling you to come be their consort, you need to lie down and let it pass. And folks, we are out of time. So back to you guys, to the DragonCon squad.
Thank you all for coming and having a good time with us. It was a pleasure, and we are glad to have seen you and spent so much time with you guys. I hope that we get to do this again soon, whether it's through the monitors or in person.
Hopefully in person. You'll see that my head is actually this much bigger than everybody.
He doesn't.
Dave, I hope that your head is that big.
It is
person.
actually. I'm like 12 feet tall.
We'll have to shrink it back down to size when I see you again.
And
All my hands
Cecilia
custom.
brings a cat too. I think the cat needs to come to DragonCon.
Oh, he would be terrified. Yeah, he likes to come and hop in only when I was talking.
Yeah. Thanks for having us. This was a really fun.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you guys. I learned a lot. That was fun.
Yes,
This was a lot of fun.
Thank you all for coming in, and I'm glad we got it all worked out.
Thanks again. It was a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. You're very welcome, guys. Thank you all for spending some time with us, and we'll be seeing you guys in a couple of months.